Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about parenting science in sport with Dr. Sam Thrower and Professor Chris Harwood. Sam and Chris, welcome.
Hi Dan, nice to be back again.
Thanks Dan, good to be back.
Yeah, as you've both mentioned there, you're returning guests, so honoured to have you back, and this time we're going to be talking about all things parenting science in sports. So really looking forward to unpacking a paper as well as the origins of that paper and talking about the benefits of collaborating with governing bodies around parenting science in sport. So before we get on to that, let's do some reintroductions here. Sam, let's come to you first. Tell us about yourself and your work.
Yeah, hi everyone. I am a returning guest, so I'll try and keep this fairly brief. But I'm still a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Oxford Brookes University. And I completed my PhD with Chris back at Loughborough University in 2016. So I've been sort of teaching sports psychology since then and researching within the area of youth sport for getting on to close to 10 years now. But generally in terms of sort of the interest in this area, I've always been interested in sort of the psychosocial development of young athletes, and particularly how we can create environments that prevent a lot of the issues and challenges happening further down the line, both within and outside the context of youth sport, really. And of course, we know that parents have the most influence in terms of children's psychosocial development, right up until sort of early adolescence, where the coaches and the peers become more important. So that really kind of got me interested in sport parenting, and has, I guess, kept me interested in it for the last 10 years or so.
Let's embarrass Professor Harwood whilst he's with us. What was he like as a supervisor and mentor, Sam?
He was good. Yeah, he was good. I mean, we used to have a lot of long meetings. But yeah, we managed to produce some good work. So I think it worked out all right.
Brilliant. Over to you, Professor Harwood. Chris Harwood, welcome back. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Thanks, Dan, and it's great to be back. And thank you for being so generous there, with that endorsement of me as a supervisor, Sam. I started back, obviously, a long time before Sam did, back in the Jurassic era, field ancient history. Back in the 1990s, I did all my degrees at Loughborough University. And obviously, last time we were on the show, Dan, and we were talking about achievement goal theory, which was the focus of my PhD. You're looking at the way children, define success and failure, and how we can support them better in their sense of achievement and their development of competence through sport, which obviously was a part of my career for a long time. I think broadly, as you know, I'm very, very interested. I have an interest in the psychological development and support to young people through sport. So that's really kind of my purpose as a sports psychologist. And I've always been a very scientist practitioner in the way I go about my kind of life. And I've spent, obviously, time in industry, working within professional football and also within tennis, as well as obviously managing my academic work as an applied researcher, and developed obviously my interest into, as you know, the 5 C's approach within soccer, but also within parenting, and particularly parenting in tennis, probably where we'll begin in a bit. But that's in essence how I got to know Sam as a PhD student, 2012 I think it was. And obviously then we've continued to work together, really trying to further the science of sport parenting in that space, ever since. So it's been a really great journey. And like I say, Sam was a really great PhD student as well. Proud to be able to support him.
Well, after that wonderful love in there, recalling our conversation, Chris, about achievement goal theory and the 5 C's that you've mentioned there. Achievement goal theory, a theory you've contributed massively to in sports psychology, and obviously the 5 C's has helped coaches around the world, especially in the world of football, to introduce psychosocial skills into their practice. How's the tennis going? You still playing?
I am still playing, yeah. I'm still playing vets tennis. Yeah. Still playing actually over 50s now. we've been fortunate in our club, in like a small little club, Leicester Forest East, to win the national club championships.
Wow.
A few years in a row, or be finalists a few years in a row, as well as the over 45s, the age group down. So I came back from Turkey recently, playing the European Championships for the club. We came fourth, so very tiring on a clay court as a 53-year-old man with no car. But still enjoying the competitive battle out there.
You're not quite getting around the clay court like Rafa Nadal, then.
Definitely not.
Are you the assigned player psych of the group? The sort of the twin role.
I do have that identity, within the group. It's very difficult to live up to. I mean, there's sometimes there needs to be some research on kind of being a sports psychologist who's competing at a sport, because it's really quite stressful, because they just expect you to close out matches and win all the time, and it's very, very challenging sometimes to actually walk the walk there. But that's another research project, I'm sure. And we all have 5C water bottles as well on court that we take, and actually 5C badges on our tennis shirts as well. So we're well up there in terms of psych support in our matches.
The 5C branding is dripping from your team there. I love it. Brilliant.
Well, we need all help we can get.
Hey, look, we're going to unpack this paper on parenting science in sport. You guys have done such incredible work over a number of years in this area, especially in tennis. And this paper, I'm going to read the title. It's a mouthful, but we are going to unpack it. And we'll come over to you first, Chris, to discuss the origins here. But the title of the paper is Evaluating the Optimal Competition Parenting Workshop Using the Re-AIM Framework, a 4-year organisational level intervention in British junior tennis. And this is a paper that you've co-authored alongside Chris Spray as well from Loughborough University. Chris, coming to you first, give us the origins of this paper if you can. Just begin at the beginning for us.
Yeah, I think that most people will be aware, I guess, of a number of years ago, they understand the role of parents with supporting their children in sport, and maybe for the older generation, a lot of the papers that we see in that research were probably around maybe the implications perhaps of negative parenting behaviours on children's outcomes. So the way that maybe parents create anxiety in kids, and I don't know. I felt that the science was a little bit more parents as problems rather than parents as supports. And I lived through the 90s, obviously reading some of that kind of narrative. And I remember a situation happened in 2005, which some of you might remember, Dan, around the Christophe Fourvieux case. And this was a French tennis player's father who was convicted of manslaughter because he basically spiked his son's opponent's water bottles with an anti-anxiety drug, with Temesta, and it caused one of his son's opponents to collapse on court, and then later on to try and drive home. But the school teacher player, as he was killed in the car crash, and he was charged and convicted with, I think, about 26 counts of tampering with opponents' water bottles, because he just wanted his son to win matches. So he was drugging his son's opponents to get that goal. So it was a massively tragic case in sport at that time. And, whilst we all, then judged parents as a result of that, I think there was very little focus at that time of actually just understanding parents, understanding why would a parent behave that way? What's it like for parents out there in terms of supporting their children in sport? Because it's not an easy task. I think that particular incident really sort of triggered me to say, okay, well, let's look at this from the parent side of the coin here. And so the real origin probably was partly that event, but then I did a series of papers working with Camilla Knight, who was actually my undergraduate student and my master's student at the time at Loughborough. And we basically investigated parenting stresses in tennis. So looked at stress from the parents' point of view, and came up with an immense amount of information. Really, parents wanted to talk about all of the challenges that they faced, all the little strains and stresses existing in the sport. And from the point of view of both competition stresses and what made it stressful around competition, before, during, after matches with their child, what made it stressful from an organisational point of view in terms of being a stakeholder in the system, the tournament structure, the logistics, the journey, the family routines, the finances, etc. And also what was challenging about it from a developmental point of view, in the sense of parents making the right decisions for their child around the balance between tennis and schooling and education, the right training load in terms of preventing injuries, the issues around injuries if they happen for their children, so developmental stresses along their child's journey. And the research showed us how that changes across stages, certain stresses being less stressful or less prominent at the sampling stage with the early junior under 10s kind of kids, but much more stressful in certain areas, under 14, 15, as they're going into adolescence, and it's getting a bit more serious there. So that particular project really illuminated kind of the needs that parents had. And it's kind of, don't just judge us, kind of really work with us, because we need help here. It's not an easy task. And then really enter Sam in 2012 for his PhD, because I was working at the LTA then as the psychologist at the National Tennis Centre for a couple of days a week, and wanting to try to promote research in the area of youth tennis and parents. And so I was lucky enough to get a funded PhD from Loughborough actually at the time, to work in this space within tennis. And Sam was my student, and looking at really the education and support needs that tennis parents had. And I'll hand over to Sam to explain that, because that became the origin paper of this paper. But over to you, Sam, in terms of what our experience was like there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I guess my first task as a PhD student was to dive into the literature, and Chris has obviously spoken about the sort of the studies focusing on parents' experiences and the stresses, but there was also a lot of other papers out there around sort of the role of parents in children's sport socialization, parents' influence on child outcomes, parenting styles, parenting practices. So we had this sort of quite a big body of work, and I think some people often think that sport parenting is quite a niche topic area, but there are about 200 articles that have been published right from the origins, sort of the late 1960s up until I started reading around this topic in 2012. But what was amazing was that there hadn't been a single published intervention study specifically with sport parents. There'd been a few studies that had involved parents, but are typically focused on kind of athletes, and therefore had looked at the people around the athletes and the parents and the coaches and trying to kind of involve them in the process. But not a single study, that are directly focused on interventions with parents. And I guess what we wanted to do was try and fill that gap, try and use this kind of knowledge base to inform an intervention. And as Chris kind of alluded to there, well, we knew a lot, but we didn't really understand what parents wanted and needed. And we didn't certainly understand what tennis parents in the context of British tennis needed and how that might change across developmental stages. So that's really where we began. I spent a lot of time for about 6 months in high performance tennis academies, wandering around and talking to parents and asking them what they wanted, what they needed in terms of education and support, and trying to figure out how that changed alongside kind of their child progressing through the developmental stages. And that was fascinating. We kind of developed a whole theoretical framework of that. And equally, we spoke to coaches, because we started to realize that parents don't know what they don't know. And of course, coaches would have worked with hundreds of different parents and therefore can answer those questions really well around what parents need at different points in the journey to make sure that they can really support children kind of optimally. So we really used that as the basis for then developing an intervention. And it was kind of developing, implementing and evaluating interventions with parents. And sort of we had a program that looked at things like helping parents understand sort of the organisational structure of British tennis, child development, talent development, how to interact with children before, during and after matches. And we delivered it face-to-face to begin with. We also then delivered it online, which was quite novel back then. and now, of course, we do this all the time through Zoom, but nobody was doing that back in sort of 2016. So we kind of developed a website with different educational videos and quizzes and open discussion forums, and sort of evaluated pre and post things like parent knowledge, the emotional experiences, the goals they had for their children, as well as their sort of confidence in their ability to fulfill their roles, and saw some really sort of nice positive directional changes in that body of work. But that was really the sort of the point in which the LTA obviously heard about what we were doing. And got in touch with us and said, look, we're interested in working with parents. We want to support parents more. Let's sit down and have a discussion. And we started working with the safeguarding team. We ended up actually working more with the competitions team. And of course, because they were interested in sort of competitive tennis, they were particularly interested in the workshop that we were delivering that was centered around how to interact with children before, during, or after matches. And that was really the first thing that we rolled out as part of a kind of parent education support strategy with the LTA in 2017. So we piloted it across sort of 10 different locations within England, Scotland or Wales. And the feedback was really good. I think about 90% agreed or strongly agreed that it had some sort of positive experience, or they had a positive experience and its sort of positive impact on how they felt as parents. And that was enough for the LTA to kind of buy into the process and agree to roll it out on a sort of organisational level. And we set some objectives back in 2018 of running sort of 50 workshops and trying to get 1,000 parents through the programme. And of course, Chris and I were sitting there thinking, well, we can't deliver all of these workshops ourselves. So we ended up sort of training up 20 tutors. And these are people that were interested in sports psychology, but had a sort of background in delivering coach education as well. So we trained them up to deliver workshops, and they went away and essentially delivered it in their different regions. And that's really where sort of Chris and I took a little bit of a step back and said, well, let's focus on trying to evaluate whether this workshop, has any effect.
I'd love to hone in on the specific contents of those workshops. Are you able to share what educational experiences you gave to parents in those workshops?
Yeah, so the competition parenting workshop, which this paper really kind of focused on, was really a sort of 2-hour interactive workshop designed for kind of parents of competitive players between sort of 9 and 14 years of age. And the workshop included 5 sort of key sections. We start off by looking at the psychological demands of tennis. And Chris always takes the lead on that section. That's his kind of forte. And that's really just around trying to help parents appreciate how difficult and challenging it is for their children on court. And I think particularly if parents have never played sport or certainly never played tennis, that can be quite an important exercise to guide them through. We then talk a little bit about kind of children's preferences for parental behaviour, drawing upon some Camilla Knight's research. And then the sort of centrepiece of the workshop itself is around pre-match, in-match and post-match communication. And a lot of that is really built on the kind of principles of trying to create a more mastery or task-orientated motivational climate. One of the challenges, I think, particularly in individual sports like tennis, with a sort of rating and ranking system, is that children do become quite ego-orientated quite quickly. And of course, that's fine if they're winning and being successful, but there's those kind of natural challenges that often happen when they move up an age group or they go through a bad spell of form or they get injured. And they're not being as successful as they were before, and that can impact on their kind of perceptions of competence and overall motivation. And therefore, what's so important is that coaches and parents create those kind of more master-orientated environments, because they act as a kind of safety net when they go through those inevitable bumps in the rocky road. So that's really kind of the theoretical underpinning for all of the different tasks and activities that we go through. We try and show kind of parents ways in which they can interact with their children to demonstrate those types of messages.
Chris, coming over to you, Sam has probably stolen your thunder here in terms of alluding to quite a few of the psychological demands. But when you were writing, delivering these workshops from a psychological demands perspective, what kind of education did the parents receive?
Yeah, I mean, Sam knows that this is my favourite part of the workshop.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that when we did it face to face, and then when we did it online, post or during and post COVID, it was really great to see, for example, the parents coming up quite intelligently with some of the specific demands that they'd already realised about tennis. But the things that we draw up, because the way we do it is we ask them, what makes tennis psychologically tough, for you and your child. And if you want to press them, why is tennis tougher than football, type of thing. You want to nudge people in the room to sort of spice things up a little bit. And then you do the reveal. I've got a reveal slide, and I guess the things we obviously pick up on is clearly the individual nature of the sport. I always reinforce a picture with Federer at Wimbledon on his own with 15,000 people around him, because you're lonely but never alone. As a sport, it's a very exposing sport. We talk about high identifiability sport. You're on all the time. You can't go and hide. You don't want to have the ball passed to you. Tennis is not that sport. You're on every half a second in terms of your performance you're responsible for your performance on your side of the net. We draw on the scoring system of tennis, the fact that you can't build up a big lead and just then wait for the clock to run out like you can in football. We draw loads of analogies across the differences between tennis and other sports. We look at the decision-making requirements of tennis, about 700 decisions a match or more. We look at court surfaces. We look at, playing different people on different surfaces, every different tournament, left-hander, right-hander, in the sun, in the wind. Lots of different demands that come out from an environmental point of view. And of course, one of the big things that we pick up on, without the fact there's no teammates to help you out to close the match out. It's not as if you can, ring up a big server like Ivo Karlovic to close a match out of 5-4 just because he's got a good serve and you haven't. So, there's no substitutes in tennis. We also get to the achievement goal point, which is there are no personal bests in tennis. There's no style marks for your volley or a score for your serve unless you're actually keeping a statistic going. Tennis doesn't provide you with KP, knowledge of performance, if we go back to a psychological construct. It just provides with knowledge of results. 6-2, 6-2. A 6-2, 6-2 loss gives you the impression that it was an easy match that you lost, whereas actually you could have made 100% correct decisions in something you're working on within the game, and gone through your between point routine and shown degrees of composure in response to challenging events, to a high level in terms of what psychologically your process goals were. But tennis won't give you that feedback on its own. So I, as an achievement goal theorist, always overemphasize that point, because by definition, it's a very ego-involving sport, easy to lapse into that language. And we need to find ways as parents to help a child be more task involved. And these are the challenges that we face because of it. So by the time they leave that section of the workshop, and with the information they've also provided, they very much, I hope, and I think they very much realise that, yes, it's psychological, and they play a really key psychological role in how they support and tee up their child for the match to come, for the event to come.
When you reflect back on the delivery, and I suppose I'm asking a slightly unfair question here because I'm asking you to think about a specific of around about 6 years ago, although I'm sure you've delivered these subsequently over the years. Is there ever, you said you invited parental comments and parental experiences. Was there, especially around things like goal achievement, was there ever much, and has there ever been much pushback there from parents? Parents who see things a little bit more black and white, the will to win, if you like, rather than breaking it down to process and sort of pushbacks like that. Have you experienced much in this process?
It's quite interesting, Sam, isn't it? Because we still do the workshops, Dan. We still run them with the LTA, in terms of the organisational strategy. And I think by and large, parents, and particularly when we come to the section in the workshop where we put some comments, some statements that parents make to their child before a match, and we ask parents, is this a highly pressurizing statement to make, or do you think this is something good to say to your child before they go into court? And we progressively go from bad to excellent examples of it. And by and large, the parents are very good at identifying what is not the right thing to say in terms of pressurizing tennis, pressurizing their child to win, a match. And I think that we don't get a great deal of pushback on it from the vast majority of parents. I think that what we do get an observation about from many parents actually is, crikey, I'm the parent who actually uses some of that language, and I can actually begin to see now why my child sometimes might become anxious or might not sometimes watch me to play, matches. I don't know if you've got an opinion, Sam, on that, but I don't think we get massive amounts of pushbacks that it should be all about ego and not about task.
Yeah, I think the sort of pre-workshop booklet helps in that regard. And we sort of talk through self-determination theory and achievement goal theory, and hopefully in a fairly persuasive way that gets parents to sort of buy into that process. But I think generally they sort of understand the idea of like the importance of getting the child to focus on the behaviours they need to engage in order to perform well, rather than sitting there focusing on kind of trying to get over the line and win the match and thinking about ultimately, what's going to happen if they do or don't win that point. So I think they understand that their children time travel quite a lot, and therefore actually trying to get them to sit in that present moment and actually think about the behaviours that will help them execute the next point. I think a lot of parents intuitively understand that. And a lot of them will always talk about, well, my child's great in training and struggles to implement that in competition. So I think they understand, how they shift from sort of being task orientated to ego orientated, and how they don't perform particularly well in that ego orientated state most of the time. So I think it's really around kind of setting that message at the beginning in order to then work through the workshop and show them how they can create an environment that's a bit more master orientated.
And just to say, we actually have a section at the end of that pre-match kind of conversation, quiz or exercise where we actually go through goal setting. So we actually do finish that section off by educating parents on goal setting from outcome, process, performance, or outcome, performance, and process. So we acknowledge, obviously, that there's an outcome there, but I know Sam reinforces kind of the example of, the outcome goal of winning a tournament here, but then the performance goal of improving first serve percentage or working on first serve. And then obviously then the process goal of ball toss or other behaviours. And so it's that kind of solidifying their learning that they can, we know that outcomes are there in tennis, but actually the process is bottom up here, and how parents can really support their children on those range of behaviours, not just technical behaviours, but also psychological behaviours that they can draw from the match there as well.
I think it's interesting. I think, drawing from my experience working with parents, whether it's workshops or formal or informal conversations, I actually find parents can understand things like goal achievement theory with relation to the experiences they have in their workplace. It seems to be intuitive to some of them, not all of them, but some of them, that what we're asking young players, young people, and older alike to do from a goal setting perspective is to break things down to specific tasks, a process, if you like, that builds up to give them their best possible performance and outcome. And actually, when parents sit down and think about it, the feedback tends to be, oh yeah, that's actually what I do. That's what I do in my work. That makes absolute sense to me. There's just something about, I don't know if it's the kind of socio-cultural messaging in sport over the years around outcomes and around performance that tends to orient people, the general public, and parents towards got to win, got to win, got to win, got to perform, got to perform, got to perform. That's the best way to be. That's a winner's mentality, and it requires that educational process. And then they go, oh yeah, actually, that's what I do in my workplace. I break it down, I focus on that, and then we produce the outcomes. No question, just a thought back at you from my experience of delivering on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Sam can chip in, here, but I think one of the key things that parents, at least in the parents we meet in tennis, in that sport, recognise the challenges of the organisational system, the ratings and ranking system, and they've cited that as stresses in the past, and they will refer to that, in terms of, how to support their child in managing, their own support, but also trying to help a child who's very win oriented, because it's not it's not just the challenge of the parent monitoring their own language and support process to their child before a match where they could be anxious. It's also parents who know exactly what is going on and trying to bring a child back from themselves being very ego oriented, where they turn up and look at the draw and say, oh, I'm playing him again. Oh gosh, I need to win this. And actually they're already very nervous about the outcome. And as a parent, your role is to say, okay, well, I understand how nervous you are, and I appreciate, your perception of this particular problem. But let's just break it down again and look at what you can control, and let's start from the kind of things that you can achieve and work on in this match that's going to kind of help your performance kind of from point to point. And so I think parents come at it from recognizing that the system isn't perfect, that there are ratings at that age, which I think is a different conversation about whether there should be that, but how they can not only ensure that they monitor themselves as parents and their own goals for their child, but that they can actually have a fundamental role to help their child get into the right state, because the child's very, very observant already at the consequences of losing a match at under nines, at under tens, there. And I think maybe unique to tennis, or more unique to tennis, is that in our system that the primary caregiver of the parent is also the assistant coach at matches, because coaches at the lower level, grassroots and county, rarely go to tournaments. So the reason why we run the course for parents with the LTA is because they are the ones who are almost the assistant coach support system for children at those events, because coaches just aren't there at those events. That's a cultural aspect of the game.
You said something really interesting there, and it makes me think of the minefield of these kind of landscapes that a child has to maneuver themselves in amongst four factors or elements here. That's the overarching systemic messaging from the governing body, the coach messaging, the parental messaging, and their own messaging to themselves. So it's a challenging pathway to navigate. And I, just as you were speaking there, Chris, and I don't want to dwell on this too much because you've both answered this succinctly, but coming back to the pushback, it does make me think, I suppose that's where I'm going with any kind of pushback as well, is if a parent sits there and goes, this is awesome, this is great, this is lovely. Yet at the same time, our governing body is producing statistics, data, rankings that orients people's attention towards performance and outcome. So there's a bit of a push-pull tease there, isn't there? On the one hand, we're going, well, this is in place here, and this gives us an understanding of where your child is in the grand scheme of things. But we kind of want you to ignore them, or at least we want you to have a sophisticated relationship. Your child must have a sophisticated relationship with these data points and these rankings. I suppose, in many respects, you're kind of teasing growth out of a young person, aren't you, in that respect?
Sam, do you want to answer that one? I can talk forever.
No, go on, Chris. This is your world.
Well, I think that you could have many conversations with senior people in a governing body about maybe what the competition structure should be like for developmental optimization. Between in childhood, between 7 to 10 years of age, and whether you should be keeping score, and you should be learning how to manage the competition process in tennis, and there should be scores there because you need children to understand there is winning and losing, and there is a process of scoring here, notwithstanding calling your own lines as well, because I've got kids now. I've got 9-year-old twins who play a little bit of tennis, and one of the big things I notice is the challenges of a 9-year-old calling their own lines in tennis and keeping score and being honest and being fair, when a football under 9s don't have that issue because there's a referee managing the situation there. So we can all talk around some of the different developmental ways in which we can kind of I want to say progressively modify games towards at appropriate pacing, towards ensuring that children are still in the game of tennis, are still there by the time we get to 11, 12 years of age, and are ready and developmentally ready to cope with the winning and the losing piece, because they've not had to deal with some of the perceptions that they have of their lack of confidence because they've not won everything and their ratings have not gone up at an appropriate pace. And so I think, you do get the pushback from parents around it. And the answer we always give is we appreciate the structure of the game. And the key thing to focus on is to be as mastery oriented as you can through this period of tennis. So your children gains multiple sources of achievement, and their personal theories of achievement is beyond just the outcome of the match. There are other things that are valued, other things that you value, other things that they value in terms of their competence and their endeavour, and that keeps them motivated in the game because they respect themselves and they know others respect their developments and their improvements in other areas beyond just solely the outcome. And I think that's something that we always strive to emphasise within the workshop, because we know it's going to be a persistent point that that parents are going to face.
I love that term, personal theories of achievement. Wonderful contribution to someone's epistemological chain. There we go. I sound like a real psychologist there. Sam, I just want to come to you here. We've unpacked the psych demands, and I also want to unpack the findings in the paper. That's what we're here for today. But just briefly, the educational program related to psychological demands, behaviours and communication pre, during, post tennis. Just briefly pausing on the behaviours. Great work from Camilla Knight, who's been on the show. Absolutely fantastic work from her. But can you unpack that for us a little bit, and also the communication pre, during, and post games? What kind of educational package did you offer there?
Yeah, I'll try and summarise. I mean, the first task that we do around kind of looks at really children's preferences for desirable and undesirable behaviours before, during, and after. So some of Camilla Knight's research kind of addresses that, and therefore we give parents a range of different behaviours. And we say, well, how do you think children would categorise them? Do you think children would perceive them to be desirable or undesirable? So we kind of work through a range of different behaviours, and then parents kind of make a note of that as we go through them. And then we sort of do the reveal. And that really provides the basis for the sort of main part of the workshop, because then we know what children want in terms of parent support, and what they don't want, and equally know some of the sort of underpinning theoretical frameworks. And that then provides the basis for going in to look at the examples of how to interact with children. So when we show them a kind of an example of what a parent could say in that moment before the child goes on court, and we read it out, and it's a bit like Strictly Come Dancing, where we ask parents in the chat function for a score. Is it a 1 star, is it a 5-star example, or something to say? But ultimately, what's the rationale for that too? And they'll read something and say, it's a 1, or it puts a lot of pressure on the child. And then we kind of do the follow up to that, where we really sort of start reading between the lines and start thinking about, okay, well, what is this type of communication? What's it really communicating to the child? What's the child going to kind of think if somebody says that to them? And we work through a series of different examples, and they tend to get better and they improve. But there's a lot to kind of critique as they go through, and parents are pretty good at that. They kind of get the activity, and they become very good at critiquing and saying what the parents are doing wrong. And then we obviously finish with much better examples, and that are much more mastery orientated, and sort of the ones that differ for very young children that are a little bit more directive, and the ones for slightly older children that are a little bit more conversational and a little bit more sort of autonomy supportive and put the ownership on the child. And then that's the point in which we sort of say, right, we've now over to you in terms of planning what you're going to say to the child, to your child, perhaps before they go on court in the next tournament. And we get parents to write them down and read them out. And we kind of also try and provide feedback there in terms of, well, that's a great thing to say, but it's really long, complex. And I can't even remember the first point that you said. So, can we make the messages really clear and concise? We always look out for examples of kind of the theory of ironic effect. Don't be anxious. And I always say that's well intended, but equally, we know saying that sort of thing to a child is not great, because one, we're labeling them as being anxious, and equally, we're not giving them any strategies that might help them manage that. So is it better to say, remember to take your time between points, or remember to take a couple of deep breaths before you serve? So then we sort of really hone in on the kind of intricacies of the language and what parents can communicate. So that's really kind of the first part of the workshop. We then go on in the second part to look at sort of the transactional stress process, and where kind of parents can almost try to change the thinking that causes some of the emotions that they experience whilst watching their children compete. And that feeds into some sections on body language, and we look at some examples. And then we go through a range of different kind of things that might happen during a tennis match, like your child hits an easy forehand volley into the net. How do you typically respond? What sort of messages that communicating to the child? What does an optimal response look like? So that's sort of section 2, and then the final section, of course, is the car journey home. And we talk about the timing of feedback and how we don't achieve a lot in very emotional states, either super happy, super upset, and sort of how emotions cloud rational thinking. We use that as then the basis for saying, well, you want to make sure that your child's ready to have a conversation about the tournament. But then we sort of give them a little bit of an interview guide with a structure to it, around how can you ask genuinely open questions. And if you get a 1-word answer, it's probably time to park that and not come back to it. If they seem like they're ready to talk, how can you help them unpack the experience and sort of reflect on action, and help guide them through that sort of reflective process of what did you do well, what could you have done differently, what might you do differently next time, and how that can be then fed back into the coach design training and so on and so forth. So that's sort of a broad overview of the structure of the workshop itself.
So moving on to this paper, I'd love to unpack this. I mean, staying with you here, Sam, because you led on this paper. Obviously, it's an assessment of this these parenting workshops. Can you talk us through this paper a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So we used a framework called the REAIM framework, which was used a lot in kind of public health and behaviour change research, essentially to evaluate organisational level interventions. So it goes beyond just that notion of, well, let's evaluate pre and post effectiveness, and takes a much broader look at it and say, well, what proportion of people are you ultimately reaching? How well was it actually adopted and implemented by the people involved in the process? So the Lawn Tennis Association, how many workshops were run based on the objectives that were set? Was it implemented effectively? Is there a difference, for example, between Chris and I's feedback scores versus the other tutors? Or, did we do a pretty good job in training them up and making sure the quality of the workshop was the same across the country? And of course, maintenance as well, in terms of saying, well, once we leave, is it something that's implemented by the organisation? Does it become part of policy? Have you made a genuine change, or is it just an intervention that's really driven by the researchers to get their data and then to leave the field? So it takes a much kind of wider look at ultimately what effective interventions look like, and evaluates across all of the acronym in order to answer those questions.
And I'd love to unpack this a little bit. Take us through some of the findings.
Yeah, sure. So I guess if we start with reach, we can kind of work through it in that order.
Yeah.
We knew from sort of talking to the LTA that there was about 7,500 parents that would have been sort of part of our inclusion criteria, essentially had a child between 9 and 14 and were regularly competing in tournaments. We also know, because the LTA gave us this information, that about 5,000 of those parents had clicked on the LTA parents page at some point in 2018, and over 1,000 of those had then signed up for the workshop. So that was around 13% of the kind of people that were out there that were invited and could have attended a workshop, did attend a workshop. And we were pretty pleased with that, to get almost 1,000 parents signing up in the first year. They were reached in various different ways, predominantly through emails from the Lawn Tennis Association. It was never the central topic of the email, but it was part of a kind of an update, a newsletter they were sending out. But equally, there was word of mouth and sort of coach referral social media data that was used to get the word out there, essentially. In terms of effectiveness, I guess this is the most important bit with any intervention. Did we actually make any significant change? And we saw significant improvements in terms of parents' knowledge. They became more task orientated, and they also became more confident in their role in navigating those pre and post match interactions. We saw reductions in their ego goal orientations as well, and equally some of the negative emotions that they experience in relation to competition. So particularly anxiety, dejection, and anger, which we're really pleased about, because they're obviously the types of emotions that typically drive some of the maladaptive behaviours that we see in youth sport competitions. And perhaps most importantly, the children reported that mothers and fathers were less ego goal orientated. So the children were perceiving that there were some positive changes in terms of what their parents were doing around competitions, and they're really encouraging. We were pleased with that, because it's a very brief intervention. It's only 2 hours long, so to see those changes was really pleasing, to be honest. We also had a quick look at the relationship between the motivational climates and subsequently the children's goals. And what we saw was that both mother and father initiated motivational climates positively predicted players' task orientation, but that parents' ego motivational climates didn't or weren't significantly related with players' ego goal orientation. Now that sounds a bit complex, but it does kind of reflect the complexity of the interaction to some extent. But it's essentially saying that children's ego goal orientations are not purely determined by the environment that the parent creates. And therefore, it kind of opens up that idea of, well, if you really want to shift that, you probably need to be working with the coaches and arguably the peers, particularly during adolescence. So there were some really kind of interesting findings, but overall kind of pretty positive in terms of the directional changes that the intervention had made. I'll move on briefly to talk about kind of the adoption and implementation and maintenance, and then we can kind of open up the conversation. But I'll combine kind of adoption and implementation. I think they're kind of tied together to some extent. So what we essentially had was 7 regional tennis coordinators running the programme. They set up 81 different workshops across England, Scotland, and Wales. 65 of those went ahead in all sorts of random locations, tennis clubs, of course, but leisure centres and academies and universities. And we had, as I mentioned before, 1,000 parents sign up. and the attendance rate was about 89%. So generally pretty good conversion rate for those signing up and those attending. And the feedback scores were consistent across Chris and I and the other tutors, which is an important thing to note. The quality was obviously being sort of maintained across the programme. And they sat somewhere in the kind of high fives, low sixes on a 7-point Likert scale. So we've always been really kind of proud of that. The maintenance element was and has been a really interesting one. We obviously tracked it all the way from sort of 2018 to 2021 when we started writing up the paper. And lots happened in those years, of course. What we initially did in 2019, the LTA decided to implement a non-profit charge for the workshop. It was £10, so it was essentially just covering the tutor costs. But you can imagine what happened. Less parents signed up, but the attendance rate increased. So that was an interesting thing for us to sort of wrestle with. And just before we actually had to make a decision on it, of course, COVID came along and changed ultimately what we were planning on doing. So we shifted straight to kind of online delivery. We ran a range of different kind of workshops throughout lockdown and across kind of all the way through 2020 and 2021. And the kind of sign-up rates were much better. Obviously, I think it removed some of the barriers of attending face-to-face sessions for parents. And really, we haven't looked back. You know, we've carried on doing that since then, and we still deliver a competition parenting workshop pretty much every month. And now we're doing kind of different evaluations. But yeah, this was really the starting point. And in many ways, it's nice that it has been kind of maintained.
Chris, coming over to you, any thoughts around what you learned from those findings?
I think probably my biggest reflection is what can be achieved when you get centralized support. You know, because this was a win for an organisational level intervention where the governing bodies is investing and backing this from a national scale out. So it's not maybe some of the traditional interventions or workshops that we see, which is kind of one club here doing a session for parents type of thing, and it's a little bit like I don't know, just trying to do something very, very small scale and isolated. This was a commitment by the competitions team at the LTA to say, okay, we really value this, and we're going to attach a person from the LTA to manage this with us, and that person's also going to have a team at the county level and regional level to try to scale out and organise the workshops locally. Hence, obviously, there was myself and Sam delivering some of the workshops in our regions, but also we had the 20 and 30 tutor-wide workforce nationally. And I think we're probably well over 107, 180 sessions or workshops now across the piece. So I think for me the biggest lesson was what you can achieve by having centralised backing, a central booking system as well, because the parents book on to a central website for the course in the same way as a coach would book onto Coach CPD. So they're booking onto the system. They get given the pre-course reading, a few days before to orient themselves towards the workshop, come prepared to kind of hit the ground running. And ultimately, I think we see the impact of maybe going in quite a lot of detail into the exercises. So the workshop, as you're well aware, hopefully is kind of very interactive and quite experiential. So it's giving parents, it's not a lecture on achievement goal theory type of thing. It's giving parents the chance to feel and think about and experience, what they can be saying to their child, how they can react within the match situations that are going to happen during a match when they're going to be on the sidelines, and how to reinterpret a situation, behave differently, and in the way they support their child, and also the post-match review and the way they try to help have more confidence in giving their child a sense of learning from the match. So they go away with lots of tools for their next experience. And I think that in the intervention research that we did as part of the re-aim paper, the 1 month follow-up, the 3 month follow-up, which is what the assessments, were. It was great to see these changes in parents and child's perceptions. But I think that beyond the outcomes, I think it's been the sense of being able to try and shift a degree of, I guess, policy around the way in which a governing body department approaches, parents with a real mission, and from then on, obviously, the success of the one workshop that we delivered has then grown immensely to a much bigger website for parents that the LTA manage. They now have we now do a 5 C's workshop as well as the third level offering that parents get. We wrote a mental and emotional skills booklet for parents on the back of the feedback that we had from parents from the workshop, saying, can you give us some more insights into mental skills and support our children here? So we wrote another booklet for that, which parents can download free of charge for them. And with the team strategically, we've obviously run a number of parents in sport weeks or parents in tennis weeks, alongside the focus of the NSPCC focus on parenting sport week, which is the first week of October. So for a number of years, we ran a 1 week set of events, and then the last couple of years, apart from this year, we ran Parents in Tennis Month, where we had about 7 or 8 different workshops and different offerings for parents to come on online and obviously engage in much more education and support beyond just obviously our workshops there. So it's been kind of the catalyst to a shift in the emphasis that a governing body places amongst one of its key stakeholders. But I could argue it's still just scratching the surface, really. There. But that'd be my biggest reflection, that kind of centralised scale out piece, which separates this piece of work from anything else perhaps that has been done.
Well, I mean, just coming straight back at you there, I mean, as we start to close out this conversation today, you've said there we're just scratching the surface. And immediately I think of, Sam, there you mentioned the possibility of 7,500 parents or households being involved. You're never going to get 100%, and you can't make it compulsory. But what it feels like you're saying there, Chris, and you've mentioned some things, some initiatives that you've been doing clearly to close that gap. How can you turn 1,000 out of 7,500 to 2,000 to 3,000? How can you continue to help upskill parents? Scratching the surface, what do you mean, Chris? What's next? What does this look like moving into the future? And we'll come to you as well, Sam.
Well, we definitely emphasised and still do emphasise the push at county level. So we actually had a programme where we've encouraged the counties to take responsibility for having like a county parent ambassador. So someone within the county structure who is able to liaise with the parents at local level to promote the workshops and to promote attendance. And indeed, maybe a couple of years ago, I think it was 2022, maybe, wasn't it, Sam, where the county performance officers actually put on a series of workshops, for the county level layer of British tennis, and some counties mandated that. Some counties mandated that workshop attendance if their child wanted to be on the county programme. So you have this tension, don't you, between stick and carrot, and some counties really appreciated the workshop and the education that parents get to a point. Well, we're investing in your child as a county. We really would appreciate you investing in us in terms of really helping as a stakeholder to understand and support your child as well as possible. So could you attend the workshop, please, because this is going to underpin everything we do at county training. So there is that kind of, that some counties have taken it as a mandatory workshop for parents, to take. We've still got loads of parents to go through. I think we're probably over 3,000 parents in now, but of course we have new parents coming in every year, every age group, don't we? So I think that the other elements of moving beyond the scratching the surface would be around putting on other workshops and other offerings, because the competition parenting workshop is around the competition period, the pre and the post. The 5Cs workshop for parents, the next level up is more around, psychosocial development and a bit more how tennis can help. You can help your child develop psychological and social skills through tennis and life skills through tennis, and in terms of the ways in which we can support players around tournaments and in training. So it's a little bit of another layer up. I think we've just finished a workshop off, myself and Sam, working for the ITF, the International Tennis Federation, which is a workshop for parents who are maybe 11 and 12 years of age, who are more higher level players going into Tennis Europe and International Tennis Federation events. So the transition parents understanding the pathway towards, not necessarily professional status, but understanding the next steps around the commitments required if you've got a really high level junior at that level. So a little bit more knowledge for parents to understand the system and understand the importance perhaps of the parent-coach relationship as a child enters into higher level events. There, as well as schedule and injury management and things like that. So there's all sorts of topics there that I think are really important for parents to understand. And the best way I can phrase it, Dan, is we've always phrased it a little bit like the paper that I did with Camilla on parenting expertise, developing the concept of parenting expertise. And it's not about being, sport parenting expertise. It's not about being an expert parent. It's about being as expert as you can in your knowledge of being a sport parent. And there's got to be a significant thrust around the knowledge and the opportunities for parents to become more expert as sport parents. And the thrust really should equate to what we do with coach education and coach education support, because the amount of money and investment that we put into coach CPD, as a massively important stakeholder for young people's development, of course, is probably a lot more than any governing body or organisation would put into parenting CPD. And yet we talk about parents as critical stakeholders all the time. So it falls on deaf ears when someone says we've got no money. We've got no money for parents because they're not that important. Well, actually, they are really important. And actually, if you really want to have expert sport parents, of people who are very willing and intentionally want to engage with this process, you've got to invest in some of the key topics that are going to help them to collaborate with coaches and athletes effectively. So they aren't the difficult customers. They are the very well educated customers and consumers and supporters to make life easier for coaches, if you know what I mean. That's what I would say is the important next steps.
Very well said. And coming over to you, Sam, I think Chris said a lot there. So anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously on the same page in terms of the value of a parent education support strategy, and it being kind of incremental. As soon as the parents come into the sport, what do they need to know? There's an introductory guide to competition. We've then got the competition parenting workshop, the 5Cs workshop, and so on. And it's really kind of looking at what points does the experience change for parents and how can we proactively support them through that process. And of course you get that right and the support provision for the child is optimized. And I think, hopefully the work we've done with the LTA has been a little bit of a blueprint there regarding how other youth sports organisations can follow suit. And in many ways, we hope they do. The second point that I know sort of Chris was alluding to there was around, well, don't we have the better parents, engaging in this sort of educational process? And yes, I mean, you can look at the data and you see there's definitely a ceiling effect. They come in more task orientated. less ego orientated, and they sort of leave with improvements in both directions. But of course, really, unless you make it mandatory, you're not going to perhaps get all of the parents, or even the parents that perhaps would get most from it are less likely to engage. And yeah, that's a challenge. We often have these conversations, but the LTA perhaps have never quite been brave enough yet to make it mandatory. The safeguarding team have actually sent parents on the course as sort of part of some of the challenges or the cases that they've been looking into, which is kind of, I guess, a starting point for that. But I don't know whether we'll ever quite get to the point where it's mandatory. It would change the kind of atmosphere of the workshops and that sort of proactive look at supporting parents rather than it being about addressing problems, which I don't think I'd ever quite be in favour of. But yeah, generally speaking, I think the kind of when these things are part of a wider strategy, and it's important, and that message is communicated to parents, then I guess you're going to kind of drive the interest in engaging in the educational process.
Brilliant. Fascinating stuff. Just incredible work. I mean, it's so interesting, and to mirror what you've both said, but you've emphasized there the when done in conjunction in a collaborative partnership with the governing body, that's when it feels like that top-down systemic intervention. That's when it feels like parental education. That's where it can be so effective. Gents, what a great conversation. I can't thank you enough for today. And I know that you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So coming over to you, Sam, first, how can people find you, follow you, and get in contact?
Yeah, I am on X at Dr. Sam Thrower. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and I might move over to Blue Sky at some point soon, but I haven't got around to that yet. So maybe I'll be on there in a few weeks' time.
Perfect. And same question to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'm obviously available on email at Chris Harwood, chris.harwood@ntu.ac.uk, and I'm on Twitter, X, sorry, at Chris H PhD. I've only just heard about Blue Sky because I'm a Neanderthal, so I'll be hearing more about that, I'm sure, but I'm not on that yet.
All right. Well, gents, thank you so much for today. It was brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you did too. I'd be delighted to hear from you. If you have any suggestions, please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.